Hi there, Jessica. I'm Katrina Dunn. Lovely to meet you.
Okay,
Uh,
thank you.
I saw you for the first time in Pandora, and I was so amazed by your skill. And I was so surprised. I had never seen you on stage before, but I haven't been to Stratford in a number of years. And so I guess I've missed your work there. So grateful that we get to see some of it here in Winnipeg.
Wow, thank you so much. That's very touching. Thank you.
So we're going to talk about your new play, The Dark Lady. And I know that you've done some conversing already about this, but I would just love to know very quickly how long you've been working on this, and you're about to go into production with it. Yes, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
can you give us just a really quick overview of the sort of development arc of this play?
yeah, sure. So the play came out of COVID, the
Right.
time off, right? Of actually realizing that there is no theater to be done, but there was this sort of pivot of, well, maybe there's theater to be written
Yeah.
instead. It was a company called Here for Now Theater. They're based
Mhm.
out of Stratford. And they kind of emerged from COVID as well. When the pandemic hit, Fiona Mangello is the woman who runs it, and
Yeah.
she just had this brilliant idea of realizing that we could still gather outside,
Hmm.
and that at that time, I think it was only 20 people at a time, but she had the foresight to go, well, by the time this thing is up, maybe it might be 50, maybe it might be 100, like we don't know. So she pitched to me to write something, and I had nothing. But of course, at that time, everyone was just clutching on to anything that you could to be creative. So I said yes. And I had to think about what it is that I wanted to write about.
Hmm.
And the Dark Lady came to mind. This is the Dark Lady from Shakespeare sonnets, um, because I had just read Shakespeare sonnets over Christmas in
Hmm.
preparation for playing All's Well That Ends Well at Stratford,
Hmm.
which got canceled because of COVID, but then we actually got to do it 2 years later. So I'm very happy for that. Um, but yeah, I was reading the sonnets because there's something in the voice of the writer of the sonnets that is very reminiscent to Helena's character in All's Well That Ends Well. So I had remembered these sonnets, and I had also remembered that the Dark Lady sonnets are weird and uncomfortable and angry, and yeah,
Hmm.
they really pissed me off.
Right.
So um, I guess they had stayed in my subconscious. So when I was offered to write about something, I'm like, it has to be about that. There's
Yeah.
also something really interesting that she's called the Dark Lady, but he never actually calls her that. He
Right.
calls her black. He calls her hair black, calls her complexion black. You never actually hear the word dark.
Mm.
So that was interesting too, because there's a connotation to dark that was bothering me. Anyway, I just had a lot of things swirling in my head about those sonnets. And there's a play that got written called Amelia in
Mhm.
England. It got put on. I don't know if you've seen it. Have you seen it?
No, 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 no,
Oh,
we haven't.
okay. So I had read it and seen it. And it's about this woman called Emilia Basano,
Mhm.
who a lot of people think was the Dark Lady from the sonnets.
Mhm.
And it was done with an entire cast of females. I think there's 12 to 15, maybe 20 women on that stage telling her story. But of course, it's very boosted to be like very, very pro-feminist in a beautiful way. But I think also for the sake of touting her, really giving Shakespeare the short end of the stick. Like really, he's just this dunce that steals her entire life, puts it on stage, and then
Mhm.
she's able to call him on it. And it, you know, kind of upset me because I like things to be a bit more confusing or a little bit more complex and
Mhm.
nuanced. Um, but there's something really interesting in her life that when you really like, I did a lot of research through the few months that it took to write the first draft of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I kind of poured myself into researching her as an actual human person. And so much of her life is echoed in his work.
Mm.
And then the floor kind of caved in of just like they're onto something. There's something to the fact that her life and her experiences and the kind of person that she was is reflected in his work and in his trajectory of writing women parts
Mm.
and discovering a more whole and integral sense of our inner humanity.
Mhm.
So that was really interesting. And then I was hooked. Like I just started looking at his plays and his parts and like all of his female characters, all of his young men in love and older men needing women to save them, and just kind of building a story from that. And
Mhm.
my living room looked like a mad scientist's experiment. Like it was just all these different soliloquies from his plays, all of his different sonnets, and trying to build them chronologically, and
Mhm.
then trying to add her poetry because she wrote too. She was a
Mhm.
poet in her own right. Um, Really interesting. And there's parts of her poems, there's certain lines in there that are echoes of stuff that he's written. So, I mean, they're onto something.
Yeah.
There's something
Yeah. Yeah.
really interesting there. And the first draft of it was for Here for Now. It was basically, she told me in May, I think, May, June. And I put it on in July, late July, early August. So I didn't have much time, but the thing kind of went, there's a story there.
Yeah.
And it was really kind of a narrative that I did with a friend of mine called Rylan Wilkie, who played Shakespeare and I played Amelia. And it was sort of a narrative with piecing together of actual poetry, right?
Mhm.
So that was the first draft of it. And I remember Rodrigo Balfus and I were really good friends. He was like, oh, I want to listen to this. So I made a recording of the last version of it that we did outside in the park. And he listened to it and was like, there's a play there. There's an actual play there. So that's sort of how that idea took off. And then the last, like that was what, 2020? So the last few years have been about finding the play within that narrative that I had sort of put together. Yeah,
Wow.
that's a long-winded answer.
No, it's a great answer. Thank you. That really fills in lots of gaps, and it's so interesting to me how new plays come about. And um, so you're basing one of your characters, Emilia Basano. Am I saying that correctly? Yeah.
Basano, I think that, yeah.
Basano, Emilia Basano, on this woman, Emilia Basano or Lanier. You've really been quite rigorous in your attention to her life details as they are known. We know that she was a member of the minor gentry, that her father was an appointed court musician, that she had an affair with the patron of Shakespeare, and that she eventually married her cousin. And then you kind of move beyond that into the realm um, of creative nonfiction, maybe, or creative fiction, taking a nonfiction into the fictional world. Can you tell us about how you navigated that, sort of using some of her real life and some of the things that you wanted in order to build this interesting relationship and create a character arc for her?
Yeah. I'm trying to think how I can get right into that. I think it's their poetry, it's the words. It was
Right.
reading the strong, like her poetry. Okay, I'm sorry, Amelia. It's not very good, okay? Technically. Not
Mm,
very fair because women weren't able to be trained. So just the fact that she was doing it is incredible.
right.
But it's predictable, and it's very rhythmically same. Whereas
Mhm.
you have Shakespeare that's all over the place, right? But what she was trying to do with her poetry is what is so fantastic and pioneering and incredible about it. Um, Very feminist before her time.
Mhm.
Very trying to, like, she has the main book of poetry that she got published at a time
Right.
that women
And
did
one of
not.
the first women in England to actually publish anything. Yes.
So what is that? Like, what is
Yeah.
that inside to be like,
Huge
you know
chutzpah.
what?
Amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. So right away, you have a sense of the type of person she was. And the book of poetry is called Salve Deus Rex Judaeorum, which is Latin for Hail God, King of the Jews.
Mm.
There's a lot of possibility that she was Jewish or
Mhm.
had Jewish ancestry,
Yeah.
right? At a time where you probably had to hide it. Um, and what she does with this huge long poem is take all the female characters in the Bible and tell the story from their perspective instead.
Mm. Mhm.
Um, wow, first
Yeah.
off.
Yeah.
And then she gets to Eve and she turns the whole narrative on its head, where she says, we've blamed her for it, but if you look at it my way, really he's as much to blame as her, if not maybe more, if we say that
Mhm.
man is supposed, right? And she kind of turns the whole thing. The fact that she wasn't attacked for it is incredible, first off.
Mhm.
The fact that
Mhm.
she got that in print and
Yeah.
like pushed herself to try, like, I I have so much love and respect for this woman
Yeah.
from 400 years ago. So it was something in that. It was in seeing, I get emotional just talking about it, like just seeing the resilience and the drive that this woman had, living a life that was very much in the margins of society, very much taking routes that were not of the norm, right?
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
having that kind of drive to get something out there that had her name on it is
Right.
so beautiful. And there's something in a lot of Shakespeare's strong female parts that resonate with her. Like, even just starting from Kate in Taming of the Shrew, even before that, like Rosalind in Love's Labour's Lost, like he has a progression of them and they get more and more complex and full. Beatrice, right? Paulina, when you get to Winter's Tale, there's a progression of the female psyche,
Right.
um, that I thought could be really interesting to pair them together and to create this love story between two people that are kind of lost in a
Mhm.
way, and trying to really get to something in their art in different ways. Like, he's trying to get to a truth and a realness of putting truth on stage, right? Putting truth through poetry. So there's a kind of ostentation, like you're distancing yourself from it because you're putting it into poetry. And she had a little bit more of a, it's a little bit more pushed towards politic, towards um, trying to shock, or, you know, she even
Yeah.
has at the beginning of her poem, there's this whole intro of like, listen, people, try to get on my side. Like, she has a full introduction leading people into it. And um, so that's it. They have a different way of viewing what art is and viewing how to approach uh, opening opening yourself up to the art that I thought was interesting. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, it does make sense. Absolutely. Let's talk a little about agency, as
Mm.
there's a really important scene early on in the play where she critiques Shakespeare's female characters for not having agency. And then I think we see as the play progresses that she's more happy with how he is. Um, taking her advice or taking her dramaturgy, in fact,
Mhm.
and using that to create new kinds of women characters. Can you can you define how you think of agency for us, and then maybe talk about how we like we're okay, there's two questions here. Can you define agency? Let's start with that.
Agency as a female character in a Shakespeare play, or
Yeah,
agency in
yeah,
general?
sure. Well, I think as a general term is useful, but and then maybe we'll try to get into the specifics around. I'm interested in where in the canon you see that shift and like because you proposed it as a specific spot here in the play. Yeah.
Right. Oh, wow. Well, this, like, agency to me is having some sort of feeling that you have control over the choices that you make in your life, right?
Mhm.
Um, in Shakespeare, you're dealing with a worldview and a world at a time that women didn't have a lot of control. So their words end up being where they have the control. You see that in Richard III.
Right.
Women only have the power to curse, and it's effective, which is kind of amazing, right?
Mhm.
Um, Personally, I see them as the agency that brings down the tyrant, right? It's his
Mhm.
mother's curses that end up getting to him. Um, yeah, so that's it. It's through the words, but there's also something to, like, I've had the luck of playing male parts in the Shakespeare
Mhm.
canon, and
Mhm.
there's a physicality and like a, it's like eating a really good peach when you speak um, text that's for a man uh,
Mm.
at the time that he was writing, that is just really quite incredible. And I think as that canon progresses, you start having the female parts being able to have that kind of um, poetry in their mouths as well, right? Like having that kind of muscularity to what they're saying. I don't know if that resonates, but like there's something to that,
Right, right. And so you propose, I think, in this play, that Amelia is a kind of uncredited, in a way, collaborator, like more than a muse, a kind of a very active dramaturg,
Mhm.
who's involved in the writing of these plays and having an effect on on the canon and the plays that are being developed, both through the example of her own person and how she lives, but also through very specific text-based dialogue with the playwright, and that we can see him develop because of her, and that it sort of seems to take its place among a couple of different kinds of plays, kind of bringing women out of the shadows in that way. Do you see it sort of fitting into that sort of category of feminist plays?
Ooh, could you repeat that? Category of feminist plays, like his plays or in general, or?
No, there's sort of like feminist plays that attempt to bring forgotten women or women whose work has been forgotten or uncredited out
Mhm.
of the shadows and into the light. Um, uh, is that something that you hope for from this play as well? And is that something that you want to say about Shakespeare's canon? Is that there are interlocutors, other, people working on the text that are unseen. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Absolutely, and yeah, wholehearted yes to that. History is written by the people that could and that won and that were at the top at the time, right? And
Right.
uh, it's too easy to sort of just assume that women weren't good writers or poets or artists or whatever because they just weren't there. It's like, but they were there. You just picked and chose the things that
Yes.
actually last, right? Um, and that the same goes for any kind of othered person, right? Like
Mm,
there were so many different ethnicities at the time, and we're
yeah,
just now starting to realize, oh, there were Black people in London at the time. It's like,
yeah,
yes, it's just that the stories weren't written about them, or the history, the people that actually got to write the history weren't.
yeah.
And I find that fascinating, and I find that so um, enriching an experience to realize that now and to be able to go back and give them voice and give them agency you
Mhm,
know
mhm.
uh yeah, no, there was something else I was going to say and I forgot.
In the little bit of research that I did on this character, on this woman, there it is contentious whether she was in fact Jewish, but there seems to be some evidence, some strong evidence in that direction. You mentioned very briefly in the play this idea that perhaps her one of her relatives experienced a forced conversion. Um, and I find this it's a really interesting little piece of character information. I once had the opportunity to direct The Merchant of Venice, and one of the things that happens at the end of that play is that the court decides that Shylock must undergo a forced conversion, and so I did some research around the phenomenon of forced conversions in Europe at that time, and was really shocked to find out what a massive movement it was. Hundreds of thousands of people forcibly converted from one religion to the other. And again, we can think about probably some of these forced conversions as being political in that they may likely have still practiced their own religion just in a hidden way. But I was just really taken by that particular detail, and I wonder if you think that might have influenced Amelia and or in your vision of her as a character.
Right. um well, in the research that I did, that seems like it actually did happen.
Right,
So then we're talking, that's her great grandfather or grandfather, I can't remember now,
right,
but that
mhm,
would have been in Spain and at the time of the Inquisition, right?
right,
It would explain why her family left Spain, traveled, changed their name several times.
right,
And Basano is really just the name of the town that they landed in. They landed in Basano del Grappa, which is
Right.
very close to Venice. And they were musicians this entire time, and they would build their own musical instruments, and they were very good. And her grandfather ended up being the court musician to the Doge of Venice. So like it was a big deal. And that's
Right.
how King Henry VIII heard about them, was trying to make the court a little bit more, respectable, and decided to bring in these Italian musicians to glorify the court. So all of her father and all of the uncles came and started a new life in England from that. Um, but at the same time, we have to remember that England was like that too, right? You had Protestant, Catholic, this constant switch between the two, and this deep fear of voicing anything that would be true when it comes to that, right? Like you'd have to hide a lot of that. And
Yeah.
the consequences were life changing. In fact, um, at the time that this play is being written, like really at the time that Shakespeare was writing, Shakespeare would have witnessed Queen Elizabeth's doctor be prosecuted for being Jewish when he
Mm.
had been Jewish but had converted, and it wasn't clear if he was or not. And
Right.
they killed him. And at the time that they killed him, they have an actual record that he said up to his dying breath that he loved and glorified the Queen. Like the Queen was everything to him. And then in a way, like, why does it matter? Like, should it actually matter? So whether Shakespeare had seen that and that's what influenced Merchant of Venice or not, like, who knows? Because, like he was the product of his time too. So there's no really way to know. And I think that that's what makes Merchant of Venice so interesting too, is that it is complex. But there's something in those speeches that Shylock gives that is just a little bit more open and human, and there's something empathetic there at a time where he could not have been.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you. I absolutely hear you.
Mm.
Um, uh, Emilia, the real Amelia, was given an education, and you follow that in the script here.
Mm.
And that's, if specifically for that kind of level of education, quite rare for women in that time. And how much do you think that um sort of follows how much does that create who she is so it's kind of like a sort of nature versus nurture kind of question. Are you just who you are you a product of the things that you encounter in life? And she certainly has, I mean, she has enormous musical ability. She also has extraordinary literary ability, and her savvy and know-how of how to navigate the world is also very sophisticated. And so uh, I was interested in that as a detail, that she had somebody who thought that educating women was very important, and how rare it would be to encounter that as a woman in
Yeah,
this kind of society. Anyway, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but yeah.
it's very rare. And gosh, there's a young woman that ended up being she tutored her, or there's something in that too, like later on in her life that ended up being like taking the bar even further. So there
Right.
was clearly this movement that was happening at the time, right? Of, hey, women can learn to, women should be respected for what they know. And women can, there was a little bit of something happening, and she was part of that, but she was quite early on.
Yeah.
Um,
And I
it's
read that she started a school later on in her
She
life
did,
too. Yeah, a
she
school for
did,
girls.
yeah,
So interesting. Yeah.
and was arrested for it.
Yes.
And they really did think like, oh, I really don't like what it is that she's pushing. And when you read her poetry, you know darn right what she was pushing.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah. Um, uh, so next question. So I loved the scene titles in this play, and they're all based on musical terms. Can you talk about how you came to create that convention in the play, and how did it influence the writing of the scenes themselves?
sure. So yeah, every scene is titled a type of musical notation of some kind, right?
Mm.
And well, Amelia comes from a family of musicians. Music has been running through her blood for centuries. And in fact, what's incredible is that there are still Basanos alive today, and a lot of them are musicians.
Right.
In fact,
Wow.
there's one of them who runs or I think he's retired now, but he ran the orchestra in London and had done this deep dive search on his family roots, found out that he was related to one of her uncles, and that it's a direct line back. So
Wow.
it's
Amazing.
a really important part of her. And there's music all over Shakespeare's work too,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
it's an important part of him too. And he would have worked with her uncles because they were court musicians. So when the show would have come to court, those musicians that would play the lute or the flute, like the trumpet, they would have been part of that, right? It would have been probably a really quick, okay, so this scene, then we come out, and they would have staged it, and which is also one of the reasons that they probably would have met at some point, because
Hmm.
she would have been there or have known of it. Um, yeah, how did those titles come apart? Like, I think I started to study where music comes up in Shakespeare's words,
Hmm.
and the story started to unfold in my head through the chronology of his plays, right, the canon. And I would start to dance with when she's talking alone to the audience versus when she's with Shakespeare, and it's a two-hander. And it became the sort of game of, okay, so if this is a canon, if I call it a canon, so what does that mean? What does a canon actually mean? And if you were to transcribe that literally, it's just sort of the repeat of a theme, right?
Hmm.
So then that sort of, and there was something about the idea of Amelia as a theme too for Shakespeare,
Hmm.
this reoccurring leitmotif that kind of keeps coming back in his plays and in his life and in his mind and his heart. Um, yeah, so it sort of started like that, and then it just had fun with it. It was like, okay, well, if this is solo, then like what's a word for that, or how does the musical notation, how can it be represented um, theatrically and
Right.
literally, Yeah.
Right. Great. Great notes for directors like to take. In other words, this scene should feel like this. This scene should feel like this. Thank you very much. Being a director, love that.
Great.
Um, Now, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a playwright, but we assume that playwrights often write characters as a way to say something that they find important, and you've articulated what those things are for you with this piece. Um, if Amelia is a bit of a spokesperson for you, what would be the couple of things that you feel like she has to say to the world right now that are very important?
Yeah, sure. Oh boy. Okay. I've loved Shakespeare since I was maybe 5 or 6. There was a Shakespeare in the Park company right at the park near my house.
Mhm.
And I would go early and set up a picnic and just sit like front row and get overwhelmed at the magic that was happening on that stage. And I remember seeing Midsummer Night's Dream, and they would come out into the audience. And then when the show was over, you couldn't tell the difference of like when does the play end? Like where does the stage end and the
Mm,
world begin? Because the world was the park, and they were, there was something just so electrifying about seeing that. So I've had a very long relationship with Shakespeare, and as I became an actor, um, looking as I look, and I'm also very tall, I'm 5'9".
mhm,
I I've wrestled with where my place is in this kind. Like, what are the parts that I can play? How do I deal with some of the racism that's in this text and
mhm,
this contentious kind of I adore you, Shakespeare, but also, you know, um, and there's a lot of that in there, right? Of just taking this man that is a product of his time and trying to voice the voiceless,
mhm,
the look, I have no, I think there's something in there too that you're an outsider looking in. I'm part of history, but I will be forgotten by history. And
mhm.
it's driving me insane. And it's just any kind of way to put myself out there, right? Like that plight makes my heart break. And I just felt like I had to give voice to it. And that if it did pierce just a little bit to him, like that he was able to understand and extend towards her, is everything, right? So there's something to that final speech that she gives that is, I think, where I'm going with it is that you can find yourself in that. You can make the words yours.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, yeah, there's something about that agency, that ownership, that claiming that can really empower an actor that might not feel like he was writing for them, right? But it's like, okay, but
Mm-hmm.
what can I bring to this that makes it
Right.
mine, you know? Yeah.
Yes, and every time you interpret a role, you are making the text your own, right? You're creating a kind of ownership and collaboration with that text
Mhm.
that exists from that point on, regardless of whether you've been historically invited into that space or not. Every time you do that, it's a political act, and it's a yeah. So you're saying this last speech of hers, where she identifies there's an Amelia in Comedy of Errors, an Amelia in Othello, an Amelia in Winter's Tale, an Amelia in Julius Caesar. So she goes on and on to sort of identify all the places that she can see herself in that text.
Mhm.
And there's an arc for this character through the whole play of trying to get in and stay in. And in a way, I think it's very truthful, that I hope this isn't a spoil. I hope I don't we didn't talk about spoiler alerts, but that it's the pregnancy that places her outside, that it's a bodily thing that makes her unable to continue down the path, and creates a kind of a difficult divot in what she perceives to be her own, her arc as an artist and as a person in this particular society. But I love it that, it's a play with a happy ending. It does, there is some resolve that comes from the end of it, where they both see value in this painful and complex relationship that they have, which is like a lot more than just a love relationship or an affair or whatever it is that you construe it as. It's much more, also an intellectual partnership and an artistic, sort of dance between the two of them as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a play about making plays, I think, too, right? Like
Yeah.
it's, yeah.
Yeah. Um, I thought maybe we would end, with this a little, excerpt that you've taken on page 75 from her actual poetry. Um, I thought it was so fascinating, and I thought it might be fun to just read it out loud and then say a few words about it. Would you be open
Sure.
to that?
You want to read
Um,
it? Do you want me to read
oh,
it?
do you have it in front of you?
No,
Um,
I don't.
well, I can read it. I'll do
Yeah,
my
okay.
best to
Okay.
do it smoothly. And then let's just talk about, like, so this is her writing. This is her real published writing that you have excerpted in this particular scene. Man will boast of knowledge, which he took from Eve's fair hand as from a learned book. Then men, give us our liberty again, and challenge to yourselves no sovereignty. You came not in this world without our pain. Make that a bar against your cruelty. Your fault being greater, why should you disdain us being your equals, free from tyranny? If one weak woman simply did offend, this sin of yours has no excuse, no end. This
Well,
is
that's pretty
very
good.
complicated.
That's probably the best things she wrote. That's really good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an incredible challenge. I think to the sort of the structures of gender power at the time. And you came not in this world without our pain. Good thing to remember. And make that a bar against your cruelty. There's so many wonderful thoughts in here. And you're right, it's very even. And it's not as complex as perhaps what Shakespeare, got the opportunity. And we're thinking about this as a contrast of opportunities. She got one book, he got, what is it, 36 plays, 38 plays, and a whole bunch of poems. Um, so But yeah, it's a very strong sentiment. Yeah.
It's one of the strongest parts of her poems. I think it's the those are the best verses that she wrote. And the sentiment there, like the appeal there,
Yeah.
knowing that there might be a male viewer. Like I think a lot of it was hoping that other women would read it, but
Yeah.
there's such an appeal there to try to get men on board, you know?
Mhm, mhm. Well, thank you. I'm really looking forward to seeing this and having the opportunity to experience it as a performance. And thank you so much for chatting and giving us more information about your beautiful new work.
Oh, thank you so much. I can't wait. I'm excited to get started and to start sharing it. So thank you.